Drop the weapon, Corporal. That is a direct order. Lieutenant Miller's voice cracked through the gale, distorted by the static of the comms loop and the sheer panic of a collapsing perimeter. The wind on the ridge was screaming, a physical wall of ice and pressure tearing at the loose fabric of their shelter. Elena Vance did not let go of the Mk-13 sniper rifle. It was heavy, far heavier than the ammunition crates she had hauled up the vertical face of the Hindu Kush for the last 2 days. Her gloves were soaked in the freezing blood of Petty Officer Svensson, who lay groaning in the snow 3 meters to her left, his chest plate shattered by enemy mortar fire. "Vance, we are moving! The bird is 2 minutes out!" Miller grabbed her shoulder strap, yanking hard. "You are logistics, not a shooter. Leave the gun!" Elena shook him off, her movement rigid, mechanical. Through the scope, the world was a green-tinted tunnel of shivering optics. 700 meters away, on the opposing jagged peak, 3 figures were setting up a tripod, a tube, a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. They were timing the extraction helicopter. "If I move, the bird dies," Elena said. Her voice was terrifyingly flat, barely a whisper over the roar of the wind. "You have never made a shot over 300 yards," Miller hissed, desperation bleeding into his command tone. "You will miss, and you will give away our position." Elena settled her cheek against the cold polymer stock. She inhaled, tasting copper and ozone. The wind value was full value, left to right. She had watched Svensson do this 1,000 times. She had carried his bullets. She knew the weight of them. "Corporal, clear the backblast," Elena whispered. She exhaled. The world went silent. 48 hours earlier, forward operating base, Keystone, Kunar Province. The staging area smelled of diesel fuel, burnt coffee, and the stale, nervous sweat of men preparing for violence. It was a sensory cocktail Corporal Elena Vance had grown accustomed to, though she never quite learned to enjoy it. She knelt on the corrugated metal floor of the hangar, her fingers moving rhythmically over the contents of her rucksack. It was a ritual of survival. Every ounce mattered. Every strap tightened was a promise to herself that she would not fail. 7.62 link, check. 5.56 magazines, 12 count, check. Medical overflow kit, check. Batteries, check. Her lips moved silently, a mantra against the chaos to come. Elena was small for a soldier, standing just 5'4", a fact that made the monstrous ruck she was packing look almost comical next to her frame. But under the oversized fatigues was a body forged by sheer, stubborn will. She wasn't special forces. She wasn't a door kicker. She was support battalion, attached to SEAL Team Bravo as a logistics specialist, a fancy title for a mule. "Hey, careful with that, Vance. You trip and fall, you'll create a crater." The voice was deep, laced with a casual arrogance that grated on her nerves. She didn't look up to know it was Petty Officer First Class Jax, the team's heavy weapons expert. He and the others were gearing up a few meters away, their movements fluid and practiced, a brotherhood of apex predators checking their claws. Elena finished tightening the main compression strap before standing up. She hoisted the pack. The weight hit her shoulders like a physical blow, 70 pounds of lead and Kevlar settling onto her spine. She gritted her teeth, forcing her face to remain impassive. "I can manage, Petty Officer," Elena said, her voice steady. Lieutenant Miller, the team leader, walked past them. He was a man carved from granite, his eyes constantly scanning, evaluating. He paused in front of Elena, his gaze traveling from her boots to the top of her helmet, lingering on the massive pack that threatened to overbalance her. "We are moving fast tonight, Corporal. Miller said, not unkindly, but with a hard edge of warning. The terrain is unforgiving. If you lag behind, we do not wait. Standard operating procedure for this recon is speed and stealth. You are carrying our extra bleed-out ammo, but if you become a liability, I will cut that pack loose and leave it. Understood? Understood, sir, Elena replied, locking her knees to stop them from trembling under the load. I won't lag. Miller held her gaze for a second longer, searching for weakness, then nodded once and turned away. Wheels up in 10. Let's move. The team filed out toward the waiting MH-60 Blackhawk on the tarmac. The rotors were already spinning, whipping up a frenzy of dust and grit. Elena watched the SEALs walk, Miller, Jax, and the quiet sniper, Svensson. They moved with a predatory grace, unencumbered by doubt. She adjusted her rifle sling, took a deep breath of the fume-choked air, and followed them. As she walked, the straps dug into her trapezius muscles, biting down toward the bone. It was going to be a long night. She was the outsider, the non-essential, the ammo bearer. They didn't know her name, only her utility. But as she climbed into the dark belly of the helicopter and settled into the corner seat, watching the green glow of the instrument panel illuminate the stoic faces of the men around her, Elena tightened her grip on her weapon. She would carry the weight, she would climb the mountain, and she would make damn sure they realized she was more than just a mule. The helicopter lifted off, banking sharply into the indigo sky, leaving the safety of the lights behind. Below them, the Hindu Kush mountains waited, a jagged maw of black rock and white snow, indifferent to their rank or gender. The insertion was a brutal transition from noise to silence. The Black Hawk did not touch down. It hovered 3 feet above a jagged shelf of rock, just long enough for boots to hit the ground before it peeled away into the darkness. The rotor wash battered them one last time, a chaotic hurricane of snow and grit, and then it was gone. Silence rushed back in to fill the void, heavy and absolute. The wind here was not a gust, but a constant physical pressure against the chest. They were at 9,000 feet, and the air was thin, stinging the lungs with every inhale like swallowed glass. Comms check, whisper mode. Lieutenant Miller's voice came over the internal radio loop, barely audible. Bravo 2, good, Svensson replied. Bravo 3, good, Jax added. Support good, Elena said, keeping her transmission crisp. Move out. 10-meter intervals. Watch your footing. The slate is loose. They began the climb. It was not a hike. It was a slow, agonizing ascent up a goat trail that barely existed. The terrain of the Hindu Kush was hostile by design, a graveyard of empires that did not welcome intruders. Under the green phosphor glow of her night vision goggles, NVGs, the world was a monochromatic nightmare of shadows and steep drop-offs. Elena fell into position at the rear, the traditional spot for the medic or the mule. The pack, which had felt heavy on the tarmac, now felt like a crushing burden. Gravity seemed to have doubled its pull in the thin air. Her quadriceps burned with lactic acid within the first 20 minutes, but she locked her jaw and focused on the boots of the man in front of her. Step. Breathe. Step. Breathe. She watched the SEALs move. Despite the load, they had a fluidity she envied, shifting their weight instinctively to compensate for the shifting shale. They were acclimatized, hardened warriors. She was just the girl from logistics who had spent the last 6 months organizing crates in a warehouse, now thrust into the most unforgiving environment on Earth. An hour passed, then 2. The cold began to seep through her layers, numbing her fingers inside her gloves. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen gravel and the ragged sound of her own breathing, which she tried desperately to quiet. Ahead of her, Petty Officer Jax was navigating a narrow traverse. To their right was a sheer face of rock. To their left, a darkness that dropped away into nothingness. A fall here wouldn't just be fatal. The noise of the tumbling body and gear would echo across the valley, alerting every insurgent within 5 miles. Jax stepped on a patch of black ice concealed under a dusting of powder snow. It happened in a heartbeat. His lead boot slid out. He lurched backward, his center of gravity shifting dangerously toward the abyss. His heavy machine gun swung wide, threatening to clang against the rock wall, a sound that would be as loud as a gunshot in this silence. Elena didn't think. She didn't calculate. She lunged forward. She drove her shoulder into Jax's ruck, pinning him against the mountainside, absorbing the momentum of his 200-pound frame plus gear. Her boots skidded on the gravel, finding purchase just inches from the edge. She grabbed the barrel of his machine gun with her gloved hand, stopping it inches before it struck the stone. For a second, they were frozen there, a tangle of limbs and equipment teetering on the edge of disaster. The only sound was the sharp intake of breath over the comms loop. Jax regained his footing, driving his boots into the scree. He stabilized himself and pushed off the wall. Elena stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had saved him. She had saved the noise discipline. She waited foolishly for a nod, a thumbs up, anything. Jax turned his head. Through the green glow of the NVGs, his eyes were invisible, but the tilt of his helmet was unmistakable. He pointed a finger at her, then sharply at the ground. "Back off." "Watch your spacing, Corporal." Miller's voice cut through the earpiece. Cold, detached. "You're bunching up. Don't crowd him." The reprimand hit her harder than the cold wind. They didn't see a save. They saw a liability who had gotten too close, who had almost caused a pileup. "Copy," Elena whispered. She stepped back to the 10-meter interval. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the cold and the exhaustion. She adjusted the straps of her pack, feeling the weight settle back onto her bruised shoulders. They didn't want a hero. They didn't even want a teammate. They wanted a ghost who carried bullets. "Rally point in 5 mics," Miller commanded. "Keep moving." Elena lowered her head and took another step. The rally point was nothing more than a shallow depression in the rock face, a geological scar that offered minimal protection from the biting wind. They had been climbing for 4 hours straight. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It was a living thing that gnawed at exposed skin and stiffened joints. Perimeter set. 360 security. Hydrate and refit. 15 minutes, Lieutenant Miller whispered. His command was a mere exhale of vapor in the darkness. Elena let her rucksack slide from her shoulders. The relief was instantaneous and dizzying. She suppressed a groan as the blood rushed back into her numb arms. While the men of Bravo Team naturally gravitated toward the center of the depression, forming a tight, exclusionary circle of brotherhood, Elena took her position on the outer rim. She faced the downslope, her weapon resting on a flat stone, her eyes scanning the green-tinted abyss through her night optics. She was part of the team, yet entirely separate. Inside the circle, she could hear the faint rustle of ration wrappers and the soft, rhythmic clicking of equipment being checked. They were a cohesive unit, a single organism that breathed and moved in sync. She was the foreign object, the necessary burden attached to their logistics chain. She pulled a protein bar from her pocket. It was frozen solid. She gnawed on it mechanically, the taste like sweetened sawdust, trying to force calories into her shivering body. Her gaze drifted back to the huddle. Miller was checking a map on a tablet with a red-lensed flashlight. Jax was wiping down the feed tray of his machine gun. They didn't look at her. They didn't offer her a space near the heat of their bodies. A shadow detached itself from the group and moved toward her. Elena stiffened, expecting a reprimand from Miller about her noise discipline or her positioning. But the figure moved with a loping, deliberate grace that was distinct. It was Petty Officer Svensson, the sniper. He crouched down beside her, low to the ground to avoid silhouetting himself against the skyline. He didn't speak immediately. He simply sat there, his massive Mk-13 sniper rifle resting across his knees like a sacred relic. "Canteen cup," Svensson said. His voice was deep, a rumble that barely disturbed the air. Elena blinked, confused. She fumbled for the metal cup attached to her belt and held it out. Svensson poured a dark, steaming liquid from a thermos he had pulled from his pack. The aroma hit her instantly. Coffee. Cheap, instant, bitter coffee. In that frozen wasteland, it smelled like heaven. "Drink," he ordered softly. "Thank you, Petty Officer," she whispered, wrapping her frozen fingers around the warm metal. "I saw what you did back there," Svensson said, his eyes still fixed on the dark valley below. "With Jax." Elena paused, the cup halfway to her lips. "I just reacted. I didn't want him to make noise. Most people would have frozen, or moved away to save themselves." Svensson turned his head slightly, the green glow of his goggles reflecting off the snow. "You moved toward the weight. That is rare." He wasn't mocking her. There was no sarcasm in his tone, only a factual observation. For the first time since leaving the base, Elena felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly. Svensson wasn't just a shooter, he was an observer. He saw things the others missed. "It is heavy," he gestured to her pack lying in the snow. "The ammo, the batteries, it is the lifeblood. Without it, my rifle is just a club." He reached out and tapped the barrel of his Mk-13. "This weapon is precise, Vance. It accounts for wind, gravity, spin drift, air density. But it is useless without the weight you carry. Remember that. You are not just carrying lead. You are carrying our ability to fight." He took a sip from his own cup, then poured the rest into hers. "Don't let Miller get to you," he added, standing up slowly. "He worries about the mission. He thinks you are a break in the chain. Prove him wrong by surviving." Svensson moved back to the inner circle without another word, melting back into the shadows of his team. Elena sat alone again on the rim, but the cold didn't feel quite as biting as before. She took a sip of the coffee. It was lukewarm and gritty, but it tasted like acceptance. She looked at the sniper rifle slung across Svensson's back as he walked away. She had trained on standard rifles, qualified as a marksman, but that weapon was a different beast. It was a tool of surgery in a world of sledgehammers. Elena finished the coffee, wiped the cup dry, and clipped it back to her belt. She checked her watch. 2 minutes left. She pulled her pack toward her. It was still heavy, still crushing, but as she hoisted it onto her shoulders, she remembered Svensson's words. She wasn't a mule. She was the lifeblood. "Let's move." Miller's voice cut the silence. Elena stood up, took her place in the formation, and stepped into the dark. Dawn broke over the Hindu Kush not with warmth, but with a blinding, aggressive violence. The sun crested the jagged peaks to the east, turning the gray world of rock and ice into a searing expanse of white. By the time Bravo team reached the designated observation post, exhaustion had settled deep into their bones. The OP was a narrow shelf of granite, shielded from the valley below by a natural parapet of stone. Ideally situated, it offered a commanding view of the village nestled 3 kilometers down the slope, a cluster of mud brick compounds that looked deceptively peaceful from this altitude. Svensson, set up on the primary sector. Jax, cover the extraction route. Vance, watch our 6. Stay low and stay off the comms unless you see God himself coming up that trail. Lieutenant Miller's orders were clipped. He was already prone, his spotting scope deployed, scanning the village. Elena dropped her pack behind a boulder, the straps sliding off her bruised shoulders with a heavy thud. She wanted to argue. Her visual acuity was excellent, rated 2010, and she had spent hours studying the satellite imagery of this terrain. But she knew better. She was the mule. Her job was to guard the back door while the real soldiers did the work. She settled into a crevice facing the rear flank, pulling her knees to her chest to conserve heat. The wind had died down, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. From her position, she could see the backs of the SEALs. Svensson was a statue, his eye welded to the scope of the MK-13. Miller was murmuring coordinates into his headset, logging activity patterns in the village. Elena pulled out her standard-issue binoculars. While her sector was technically the empty trail behind them, her vantage point allowed her a peripheral view of the opposing ridgeline, a massive wall of snow and rock that shadowed the valley. She scanned the terrain. Rock, snow, shadow, rock. It was monotonous work. The glare from the snow was headache-inducing, even through her tinted lenses. She swept her glass back and forth, building a mental map of the dead ground. Then she stopped. 700 meters away, on the opposing ridge, something didn't look right. It wasn't movement exactly. It was a texture. A patch of snow that looked too smooth, too uniform compared to the wind-scoured rock around it. It looked engineered. Elena squinted, adjusting the focus wheel. A glint. Tiny, imperceptible to the naked eye, but through the glass, it flared for a microsecond. Metal reflecting the morning sun. "Lieutenant," Elena whispered into her mic. "Maintain silence, Vance," Miller replied instantly, not looking up from his scope. "We have eyes on a potential HVT in the village." "Sir, I have an anomaly on the eastern ridge. Sector 4. Elevation plus 200 relative to our position." Miller sighed, a sound of profound irritation. He rolled onto his side, glaring at her over his shoulder. "The eastern ridge is goat territory, Vance. There is no tactical value up there. The target is down in the valley." "I saw a reflection, sir. It looks like a prepared position, maybe a listening post." "Or maybe it's mica in the rock, or ice," Miller snapped. He raised his own high-powered optics, sweeping the area she indicated for all of 3 seconds. "I see nothing." "Negative contact. We are tracking the courier now. Do not clutter the net with ghost stories. Eyes on your sector." He turned back to the village. The dismissal was absolute. Elena felt a flush of heat rise up her neck, burning hotter than the cold wind. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the assumption of incompetence. Because she carried the extra ammo, she couldn't possibly understand the battle space. Because she wasn't a SEAL, her instincts were invalid. She looked back at the ridge. The glint was gone. The snow lay undisturbed. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just ice. But the knot in her stomach tightened. Svensson had told her the rifle accounts for everything: wind, gravity, spin. But it couldn't account for what the shooter didn't see. "Target confirmed," Svensson's voice was a low rumble. Male, military age, armed, entering the north compound. That's him, Miller said, his voice tightening with the thrill of the hunt. All stations prep for terminal guidance. We are painting the target for air support. The team shifted into high gear, the lethal machinery of war spinning up. They were focused entirely on the village below, on the mission, on the success that was just a radio call away. Elena turned back to her sector, but she couldn't keep her eyes off the eastern ridge. It sat there, silent and white, looming over them like a raised hammer. She gripped her rifle, the uneasy feeling crawling down her spine. They were watching the prey, but she couldn't shake the terrifying sensation that they were the ones being watched. The mission, on paper, was a textbook success. The coordinates of the high-value target had been relayed to command. The drone was on station, circling high above in the stratosphere, ready to deliver its payload once the team cleared the area. "Good work. We are Ghost," Lieutenant Miller said, collapsing the leg of his spotting scope. "Pack it up. We extract to the secondary LZ. Move fast, stay low." The tension in the air seemed to dissipate slightly. The SEALs moved with the efficient haste of men who knew the job was done and were eager to leave the freezing purgatory of the ridge. Svensson capped his scope. Jax checked the safety on his heavy machine gun. Elena felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She stood up, swinging her heavy pack onto her shoulders. Her eyes didn't look at her boots or her teammates. They went instantly back to the eastern ridge, to the patch of snow that looked too smooth, to the glint Miller had dismissed as ice. The sun was higher now, casting harsh shadows across the valley. The silence was absolute save for the scrape of nylon against rock. Crack. The sound was not a bang. It was a sharp, supersonic snap that whipped past Miller's head, followed a split second later by the distant report of the rifle. Thwack. A chunk of granite the size of a fist exploded from the rock face inches from Elena's face, spraying her cheek with stone shrapnel. "Contact right, East Ridge!" Svensson roared, his voice dropping instantly into a combat octave. "Take cover!" Miller screamed, diving behind the low parapet they had just vacated. The air erupted. It wasn't just one shooter. The entire eastern ridge, the one Miller had called goat territory, came alive with muzzle flashes. Bullets hammered the position, sparking off the rocks, tearing into the frozen earth. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of snapping rounds and the deep rhythmic chug of a heavy machine gun. Elena hit the deck hard, the weight of her pack driving the air from her lungs. She crawled instinctively toward the depression in the rock, the world narrowing down to dirt and noise. "Jax, suppress that ridge. Svensson, find me a target." Miller was shouting over the din, pressing himself flat against the stone. "It's the high ground, LT. They're looking right down our throats," Jax yelled back, swinging his machine gun around. He unleashed a burst of fire, the brass casings spinning into the snow, but the return fire was overwhelming. They were shooting uphill against an enemy who had prepared the battlefield perfectly. Elena huddled next to a boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She gripped her carbine, but there was nothing to shoot at, just flashes in the distance, 700 meters away. Too far for her weapon. Then came a new sound, a hollow thump from the enemy position. Svensson's head snapped up. "Mortar! Incoming!" The warning came too late to move, only time enough to curl into a ball. The explosion hit the shelf 10 meters to their left. It wasn't a direct hit, but the concussive wave was brutal. Snow, dirt, and rock were blasted into the air, raining down on them like hail. The ground shook, Check in! Sound off! Miller yelled, coughing through the dust. Jack's up! Svensson up! Vance up! Elena shouted, her voice surprising her with its steadiness. She checked her limbs. Everything was attached. She wasn't dead. They have a 60-millimeter tube up there, Svensson said, spitting out grit. He was already back on his scope, ignoring the bullets snapping overhead. Bracketed. Next one will be closer. Miller looked at the eastern ridge, his face a mask of fury and realization. He looked at Elena for a fleeting second, a look that wasn't an apology, but an acknowledgement. She had been right. The anomaly was a kill zone. We can't stay here, Miller barked. If they dial that mortar in, we are pink mist. We need to bound back to the defilade. Jax, give me everything you've got. On my command, move. The team was no longer the hunters. They were the prey, trapped on a ledge with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of fire on the other. The ambush had been perfect, and as another mortar round whistled through the thin air, Elena realized that carrying the ammo was no longer just a chore. It was the only thing that was going to keep them alive for the next 5 minutes. The concept of time evaporated, replaced by the mechanical cycle of fire and maneuver. The enemy on the eastern ridge had the advantage of height, raining lead down onto the SEAL's exposed position with punishing accuracy. The air around the rock shelf was thick with the acrid metallic taste of burnt gunpowder and the dust of pulverized stone. Suppressing! Petty Officer Jax roared. His heavy machine gun shuddered, spitting a stream of brass casings that clattered onto the frozen ground like hail. He was the anchor of their defense, his weapon chopping at the rocks on the opposing ridge, keeping the enemy heads down just enough to prevent them from overrunning the team. But automatic fire consumed ammunition at a terrifying rate. Red! I am red on link! Jax shouted, his voice straining over the deafening noise. The belt of ammunition feeding his gun flipped wildly and then disappeared into the feed tray. The gun went silent. Reloading! Miller yelled from the left flank, his carbine clicking empty. He dropped to a knee behind a slab of granite, ripping a fresh magazine from his vest. Check your counts. Do not run dry. Elena lay flat on her stomach in the center of the formation, her face pressed against the cold scree. This was it. This was the moment she had been packed for. The weight on her back, the 70 pounds that had made her legs tremble and her lungs burn for 2 days, was no longer a burden. It was time. She rolled onto her side, unclipping the quick-release buckles of her massive rucksack. She didn't wait for an order. She knew the cadence of the fight. If Jax's gun stayed silent for more than 10 seconds, the enemy would move. If they moved, the team would be flanked. Jax, catch! Elena screamed. She grabbed a 200-round box of linked ammunition from the main compartment. It was heavy, a dense brick of lead and steel. She didn't stand up. That would be suicide. Instead, she shoved it across the rocky ground, sliding it toward the gunner's position 3 meters away. Jax didn't look at her. He reached out a gloved hand, snagged the box, and slammed it into the cradle of his weapon. In seconds, he had reloaded, and the gun was singing again, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that vibrated in Elena's chest. Vance, 5.56, need 2 mags, Miller called out, firing single shots to conserve what he had left. Elena grabbed 4 magazines from the side pouches. She crawled towards the lieutenant, keeping her profile lower than the rocks shielding them. Bullets snapped overhead, angry hornets seeking flesh. She could feel the wind of their passage. She reached Miller and slapped the magazines into his outstretched hand. For a split second, their eyes met. The arrogance was gone. The dismissal was gone. There was only the raw, frantic look of a man who needed bullets to keep breathing. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and turned back to the fight. "Svensson!" Elena called out, looking toward the sniper's position on the far right. "I am good." Svensson's voice came over the comms, calm and steady amidst the chaos. "Save the rifle rounds for the others. Do you have smoke?" "2 canisters, yellow and red." "Keep them close. We will need them to screen the movement," Svensson replied, firing a single round. A second later, a figure on the distant ridge crumpled. "One down." Elena crawled back to her pack. She felt lighter. Physically, the load was decreasing with every magazine she distributed. But psychologically, a different weight was lifting. She wasn't the mule anymore. She was the lifeline. Every trigger pull that kept the enemy at bay was powered by the sweat on her back. She organized the remaining ammunition in the snow, creating a hasty distribution point. She checked the medical kit, ensuring the tourniquets were accessible. Her hands moved with a precision she hadn't known she possessed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was buried under layers of adrenaline and purpose. "They are flanking left!" Jax yelled, swinging his barrel. "3 movers in the draw!" "Shift fire! Shift fire!" Miller commanded. The team pivoted, a synchronized dance of violence. Elena stayed low, her hand resting on the next box of ammunition, waiting for the call. She watched the brass pile up around them, glittering in the harsh sunlight. They were holding. For now, they were holding. But the pile of ammunition in her pack was finite, and the enemy on the ridges seemed to have an endless supply of hate. The battle had evolved into a math problem, one that Petty Officer Svensson was solving one trigger pull at a time. While Jax laid down a wall of suppressing fire that chewed up the rocks and kept the enemy heads down, Svensson was hunting. He moved with a ghostly economy of motion. He would slide to a gap in the rocks, extend the barrel of the MK-13, exhale, and fire. Then, before the brass casing even stopped rolling in the snow, he was moving again, shifting 3 meters to the left or right to avoid the inevitable return fire. Shoot. Move. Reset. Elena watched him from her position near the ammo pile. In the chaos of screaming metal and shouting men, Svensson was a terrifying island of calm. He was the team's reach, the only one capable of touching the enemy on the high ridge with lethal precision. "Machine gun down," Svensson reported calmly over the loop, traversing to the spotter. "Good kill," Miller shouted, firing a burst from his carbine. "Keep them off the ridge, Svensson. We need breathing room." But the enemy was adapting. They stopped spraying random fire and began to concentrate on the muzzle flashes coming from the sniper's sector. The dirt around Svensson began to erupt in angry geysers as bullets zeroed in on him. "They are bracketing you, Svensson! Displace!" Jax yelled, swinging his heavy gun to cover the sniper's movement. Svensson rolled away from his cover, preparing to move to a secondary position near the rear of the shelf. He looked up, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for the telltale puff of smoke that signaled a launch. The sound came first, a high-pitched shriek that tore through the fabric of the wind, distinct from the snap of bullets. It was the sound of death arriving vertically. "Incoming!" Svensson shouted, abandoning his stealth to dive for the cover of a granite slab. He wasn't fast enough. The 60mm mortar round impacted the rocky ground 5 meters from where he stood. It didn't land in the depression with the rest of the team, but on the raised lip of the shelf. The explosion was a thunderclap that sucked the air out of the immediate vicinity. Elena felt the shockwave punch her in the chest, rattling her teeth. She ducked her head instinctively, debris raining down on her helmet like gravel thrown by a giant hand. When the dust cleared, the rhythmic crack of the Mk-13 was gone. "Svensson! Status!" Miller screamed. There was no answer on the comms. Elena looked up. Through the haze of gray smoke, she saw him. Svensson was lying on his back in the snow, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. The pristine white camouflage of his oversuit was rapidly turning a dark, glossy crimson. "Man down! Man down!" Elena screamed, her voice cracking. She didn't wait for orders. Abandoning the ammo pile, she scrambled on her hands and knees across the open ground toward him. Bullets were still snapping overhead, but her focus narrowed to the fallen sniper. When she reached him, the sight froze her blood. The shrapnel had done catastrophic work. His chest plate had taken a heavy impact, cracked and jagged, but it was his right arm, his shooting arm, that was the ruin. The sleeve was shredded, the flesh beneath torn open to the bone, blood pumping out in bright, arterial spurts that steamed in the freezing air. Svensson was conscious, his eyes wide and staring up at the sky, teeth clenched so hard his jaw muscles bulged. He was trying to reach for his rifle with his left hand, but the weapon had been blown out of his reach, lying in the dirt with a cracked scope. "My rifle," he gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Forget the rifle," Elena yelled, ripping the medical shears from her vest. "Stay with me, Svensson. Look at me." She grabbed his shoulder strap and dragged him violently behind the cover of the main rock formation. He was heavy, dead weight, but adrenaline gave her the strength of two men. She collapsed next to him in the defilade, her hands instantly slick with his blood. "Miller, I need cover!" Elena shouted into her mic. "Svensson is hit. Bad. I need 30 seconds." The lieutenant turned, his face pale beneath the grime. He saw the blood. He saw the sniper rifle lying useless in the snow. The realization hit them all at once. Their long-range dominance was gone. The enemy on the ridge was no longer being suppressed. They were free to move. They were free to kill. "Jax, pour it on!" Miller roared, desperation creeping into his voice. "Vance, fix him! Fix him now!" Elena looked down at the wound. The red was spreading fast, soaking into the snow beneath him. The anchor was broken. The world shrank to a radius of 2 feet. The space between Elena's knees and Svensson's shattered shoulder. The noise of the battle raged around them. The rhythmic thumping of Jax's machine gun, the cracking of incoming rounds against the rock. But Elena pushed it all into a dull background roar. Her hands moved with a frantic but disciplined speed. She ripped the Velcro tab on her medical pouch, the sound lost in the chaos. The first priority was the arterial bleed. The snow beneath Svensson's right arm was no longer white. It was a slush of bright, oxygenated crimson that steamed in the cold air. "High and tight," Elena muttered to herself, reciting the medic's mantra. She unspooled the combat application tourniquet, KT, sliding the black nylon strap high up into Svensson's armpit, well above the shredded meat of his bicep. Svensson groaned, his eyes rolling back, his good hand scrabbling weakly at the dirt. "This is going to hurt," she said, not looking at his face. She cranked the windlass. 1 turn, 2 turns. The strap bit deep into the muscle, cutting off the flow. Svensson let out a guttural scream that was cut short as he clenched his teeth, his body arching off the ground. "Hold him down!" Elena shouted, though there was no one to help her. She cranked it a 3rd time until the bright red spurts slowed to a dark ooze. then stopped. She locked the windlass in the clip and checked the time, scribbling it on the strap with a grease pencil. 14:10. Vance, we are losing the perimeter. Miller slid into the depression beside her, changing a magazine. His face was smeared with soot, his eyes wide with the frantic calculation of a commander watching his unit disintegrate. Can he move? Elena looked at Svensson. He was pale, shock setting in rapidly. The shrapnel in his chest plate had cracked a rib, maybe collapsed a lung, but the arm was the killer. He's stable, but he's in shock, Elena replied, her hands now ripping open an Israeli bandage to pack the wound. He can't walk. Not yet. A burst of machine gun fire chewed up the lip of the rock above them, showering them with stone dust. Miller flinched, ducking lower. We have to move to the secondary extraction point, Miller shouted, grabbing Elena's shoulder. We cannot carry a casualty over this terrain with 3 effectives. If he cannot move under his own power, we have to leave him in cover and come back. We are getting overrun, Corporal. The order hung in the freezing air, heavy and brutal. It was the logic of war. Sacrifice the one to save the many. Miller wasn't being cruel. He was doing the math. Carrying Svensson meant moving at a crawl, and crawling meant death for everyone. Elena stopped packing the wound. She looked up at Miller, her hands covered in Svensson's blood. Something inside her snapped, not a break, but a hardening. The deference she had shown for the last 48 hours evaporated. No, she said. The word was flat, hard, and absolute. Miller blinked, stunned. Excuse me? We are not leaving him, Elena said, her voice rising over the gunfire. She wasn't asking. She grabbed a syringe of morphine from her kit and jammed it into Svensson's thigh. I carried 80 pounds of ammo up this mountain, sir. I can carry him. You clear the path. I will move the package. She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed the drag handle on the back of Svensson's vest. The sniper was a big man, over 200 pounds of muscle and gear, but the adrenaline coursing through Elena's veins made him feel weightless. Help me get him up, she commanded. Miller stared at her for a split second. In her eyes, he didn't see the logistics clerk or the mule. He saw a soldier. He nodded, a sharp, decisive jerk of the chin. Jax, smoke! We are moving! Miller roared, turning back to the fight. Pop smoke on the ridge! We are bounding back! Thick clouds of yellow and red smoke began to billow across the shelf, obscuring their movement. Elena hauled Svensson upright, draping his good arm over her shoulder. He was barely conscious, his feet dragging in the snow. I've got you, she whispered into his ear, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I've got you. They began to move, a stumbling, desperate retreat into the smoke, leaving the blood-stained snow behind. They were alive, but they were slower, and the enemy was coming down the mountain. The retreat was a blur of exhausted motion and terror. They moved like a broken animal, dragging its wounded limb across the jagged teeth of the mountain. The smoke grenades provided a temporary wall of yellow and red fog, but the enemy fire was relentless. Blind bursts tearing through the haze to snap against the rocks around them. Elena's lungs were burning with a fire that eclipsed the freezing air. Svensson was a dead weight against her side. His boots scraped uselessly over the shale, leaving a trail of disturbed snow and dark blood. Every step was a battle against gravity and friction. She could hear his ragged, wet breathing right next to her ear, a sound that was terrifyingly irregular. LZ is 200 meters. Move! Move! Lieutenant Miller shouted, his voice hoarse. They reached a flat protrusion of rock that jutted out over the abyss, the secondary landing zone. It was barely large enough for a helicopter to put its wheels down, exposed to the wind and, crucially, exposed to the enemy ridge. Miller slammed his back against a boulder and ripped the handset from his radio. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline overdose of a commander watching his options evaporate. Jaguar Maine, this is Bravo Actual. Declaring emergency. Requesting immediate medevac. Priority 1 urgent. I have 1 litter patient. Critical. Massive blood loss. Elena eased Svensson down behind the only cover available, a low spine of rock that offered minimal protection from the high ground. She checked the tourniquet. It was holding, but his skin was gray, clammy to the touch. She grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "Stay with me, Svensson. The bird is coming," she whispered. Static crackled in Miller's ear, loud enough for Elena to hear. "Bravo Actual, this is Jaguar. Weather is red across the board. Ceiling is 0. We cannot get fast movers in for close air support. You are on your own for fire superiority." Miller slammed his fist against the rock. "Negative. We are pinned down by heavy weapons. I need ordnance on the East Ridge, grid 347. Unable to comply, Bravo. Danger close is too high. Wind is erratic, but... Wait one. The radio hissed. Dust-off 30 is in the valley. They are pushing the envelope. ETA 2 mics. 2 minutes, Miller repeated, looking at Elena and Jax. The relief in his eyes was overshadowed by a dark realization. We have a bird coming, but we have no air cover. If that mortar is still active when the helicopter hovers, we are all dead. Jax was slumped against his machine gun, chest heaving. He had fired almost every round Elena had passed him. The barrel of his weapon was smoking, the metal discolored from the heat. I have 200 rounds left, LT, Jax said, wiping sweat from his eyes. That's it. Once I'm dry, we are throwing rocks. Elena looked at Miller. The lieutenant's face was a mask of grim determination, but beneath it, she saw the cracks. He was checking his magazines, counting rounds, doing the impossible arithmetic of war where the numbers didn't add up to survival. He looked at the sky, then at the enemy ridge, then at his dying sniper. He looked small. We have to hold the LZ, Miller said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. When that bird comes in, it's going to be the biggest target in the world. We have to suppress that ridge with everything we have left. From the valley below, a new sound began to rise above the wind. It was a rhythmic, thumping heartbeat that grew louder with every second. Whoop, 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 whoop. The sound of the rescue helicopter. To a soldier, it was the most beautiful sound on earth. But to the enemy on the ridge, it was a signal to bring out the heavy weapons. Elena looked up at the eastern ridge. The smoke was clearing. The enemy knew they were cornered. They were waiting. She checked her own carbine. 3 magazines. She looked at Svensson's Mk-13 lying in the dirt next to him. The scope cracked, but the action likely still functional. Here it comes, Jax said, pulling the charging handle of his machine gun. The Black Hawk rose from the abyss like a dark angel, banking hard against the wind, its nose flaring as it fought to hold a hover over the rock shelf. The noise was deafening, a storm of rotor wash that kicked up a blinding cloud of snow. And then, the eastern ridge erupted. The arrival of the Black Hawk changed the physics of the battlefield. The massive rotors churned the air into a frenzy, whipping the loose snow into a blinding white vortex that stung exposed skin like sand. The noise was a physical wall, a rhythmic hammering that drowned out even the sharp crack of incoming rifle fire. Suppressing fire! Keep their heads down! Miller roared into the comms, but his voice was tinny and distant against the mechanical scream of the engines. Petty Officer Jax was standing exposed, bracing his machine gun against a boulder, pouring a stream of tracer rounds into the enemy positions on the lower slopes. The red streaks of light cut through the swirling snow, walking up the hillside, chipping away at the rocks where the muzzle flashes sparkled. Elena shielded Svensson's body with her own, pressing him into the dirt as the helicopter flared for a landing. The wheels were feet from the ground, the fuselage swaying violently in the unpredictable mountain currents. The door gunner on the Black Hawk opened up with a minigun, a buzzsaw sound that added to the cacophony. But Elena's eyes were not on the helicopter. They were not on Miller or Jax. Drawn by an instinct she couldn't name, perhaps the same unease that had gripped her earlier that morning. Her gaze snapped back to the high ridge, to Sector 4, to the goat territory. The rotor wash shifted the wind for a brief second, clearing the smoke and snow that had obscured the distant peak. There, 700 meters away and elevated well above their position, 3 figures emerged from the rocks. They weren't firing wild bursts like the others. They were moving with purpose. One man knelt. Another placed a long, heavy tube onto the kneeling man's shoulder. Elena's blood ran cold. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was the distinct, bulbous warhead of an RPG-7, silhouetted against the bright sky. "RPG!" Elena screamed. The sound was torn from her throat, but it died instantly in the roar of the turbine engines. She looked at Miller. He was reloading, his back to the high ridge, focused entirely on the enemies surging up from the valley floor. He couldn't see the threat above. She looked at Jax. The gunner was fixated on his sector, his weapon cycling rhythmically. The enemy team on the ridge was taking their time. They weren't rushing. They knew the helicopter was vulnerable. It was a hovering whale, a massive stationary target filling the sky. At this range, a standard RPG shot was difficult, but they were firing from a superior elevation into a hovering target. They were waiting for the pilot to commit to the landing. If that rocket hit the rotor mast or the fuel tank, the Black Hawk wouldn't just crash, it would detonate right on top of them. Everyone, the pilots, the crew, Svensson, Miller, Jax, and herself, would be incinerated in a heartbeat. "Lieutenant, 12 o'clock high, RPG!" Elena yelled again, keying her radio. Static, just static. The electronic countermeasures from the helicopter or the terrain interference had jammed the short-range loop. The man on the ridge was adjusting the sights. He was settling in. Elena looked at her M4 carbine. Effective range, 500 meters for a point target, maybe less in this wind. At 700 meters, her bullets would tumble and drift uselessly long before they reached the shooter. Jax's machine gun could reach, but he was looking the wrong way. Time seemed to slow down, the spinning rotors becoming a sluggish blur. The logic of the situation crystallized in Elena's mind with terrifying clarity. The enemy was outside their reach. They were safe. They were going to take the shot. And there was absolutely nothing the men of Bravo Team could do about it, because they didn't even know they were dying. Svensson groaned beneath her, his hand twitching. Beside him lay the Mk-13 sniper rifle. The scope lens was cracked, spider-webbed on the left side, but the barrel was intact. The action was closed. It was a weapon designed to reach out and touch the impossible. Elena looked at the RPG team again. The loader stepped back. The gunner leaned forward. She didn't make a conscious decision to move. It wasn't bravery. It was simply the realization that the math had changed, and she was the only variable left that could balance the equation. She let go of Svensson. Elena left the relative safety of the rock wall. It was a movement that went against every survival instinct drilled into her during basic training. The air outside the defilade was a chaotic shredder of ice crystals and lead, churned into a frenzy by the Black Hawk's rotors. She didn't run. She dropped flat, pressing her body into the frozen shale, and began to crawl. The Mk-13 sniper rifle lay only 4 meters away, but in the middle of a firefight, 4 meters was a marathon. The snow around her erupted in tiny geysers as stray rounds from the valley floor skipped off the rocks. She dug her elbows into the grit, pulling herself forward inch by agonizing inch. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, the cold burning her throat like acid. Her hand closed around the stock of the rifle. The polymer was freezing, biting through her glove. She pulled the weapon toward her, feeling its dead weight. It was heavy, awkward, and alien in her hands compared to her carbine. She rolled onto her back, shielding the action from the swirling snow with her body, and racked the bolt back partially. Brass glinted in the chamber. It was loaded. "Drop the weapon! Corporal! That is a direct order!" Lieutenant Miller's voice cracked through the gale, distorted by the static of the comms loop and the sheer panic of a collapsing perimeter. The wind on the ridge was screaming, a physical wall of ice and pressure tearing at the loose fabric of their shelter. Elena Vance did not let go of the Mk-13. She rolled back onto her stomach, swinging the heavy barrel toward the eastern ridge. Her movements were rigid, mechanical, driven by a clarity that terrified her. "Vance, we are moving! The bird is on the deck!" Miller grabbed her shoulder strap, yanking hard, trying to drag her toward the waiting helicopter ramp. "You are logistics, not a shooter. Leave the gun!" Elena shook him off. The force of the rejection stunned him for a microsecond. She slammed the bipod legs of the rifle into the gravel, seeking a stable platform in the vibrating chaos of the rotor wash. Through the cracked scope, the world was a green-tinted tunnel of shivering optics. 700 meters away, on the opposing jagged peak, the RPG gunner had stopped moving. He was locked in. The loader was clear. The tube was leveled directly at the hovering Black Hawk. "If I move, the bird dies," Elena said. Her voice was terrifyingly flat, barely a whisper over the roar of the wind. Miller looked at her, then followed the line of her barrel to the distant ridge. He couldn't see what she saw, not without optics, but he saw the intent in her posture. The realization washed over him. She wasn't freezing up, she was engaging. But the math was wrong. The distance was impossible for a support clerk. "You have never made a shot over 300 yards, Miller hissed, desperation bleeding into his command tone as he fired his own weapon one-handed toward the valley. "You will miss, and you will give away our position to that heavy weapon. Get on the chopper." Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. The world outside the scope ceased to exist. The screaming wind, the thumping rotors, the shouting lieutenant, it all faded into a dull hum. She settled her cheek against the cold polymer stock. She inhaled, tasting copper and ozone. The wind value was full value, left to right. She had watched Svensson do this 1,000 times. She had carried his bullets. She knew the weight of them. She knew that at this altitude, the air was thinner. The bullet would fly flatter. But the wind was the devil. "Corporal!" Miller screamed, grabbing her vest again. "Clear the backblast," Elena whispered. Her eye welded to the glass. She saw the RPG gunner's finger tighten on the trigger mechanism. He was going to fire. In 2 seconds, a rocket would bridge the gap between the peaks and turn their rescue into a funeral pyre. She exhaled. The reticle settled, It wasn't steady. It was dancing with her heartbeat, with the vibration of the ground, but she forced it to obey. She wasn't just holding a gun. She was holding the lives of every man on that ridge. The fear was gone. There was only the target, the crosshairs, and the impossible distance between them. The scope of the Mk-13 was a chaotic tunnel of green and black. The spiderweb crack on the left side of the lens refracted the light, creating a kaleidoscope of fractured images. But the center, the crosshair, was clear. Elena pressed her cheek harder against the stock, trying to weld her body to the weapon. The rifle was a precision instrument, cold and unyielding. It smelled of CLP oil and the metallic tang of Svensson's blood, which was smeared on the grip. Through the optic, the enemy on the ridge was a grainy silhouette. He was 700 meters away. At that distance, he was small, barely larger than a fingernail held at arm's length, but the RPG tube on his shoulder looked massive. "Wind," she whispered. It was the sniper's prayer. It was the variable that killed. Elena felt the gale pushing against the left side of her body. It was a full-value wind, howling from left to right at perhaps 20 miles per hour. If she aimed the crosshair directly at the man's chest, the bullet would be pushed off course by feet, slamming harmlessly into the rocks far to his right. She didn't know the math. She didn't have a ballistic computer. She didn't have a spotter to do the calculus for her. She only had memory. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and Svensson's voice cut through the roar of the helicopter. At 700, in a crosswind like this, you don't aim at the man. You aim at the ghost standing 3 meters to his left. She opened her eyes. The RPG gunner shifted his stance, widening his legs to brace for the recoil. He was committing. He was going to fire. Elena shifted the rifle. The crosshair drifted off the man's chest, sliding left, into the empty air. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed at her to put the reticle on the target. To aim at nothing felt like madness. 3 mils left, she muttered, her brain struggling to visualize the measurement. She pushed the crosshair further into the void, guessing the drift. "He's got a tone! He's firing!" The helicopter pilot's voice screamed over the radio, panic shattering his professional calm. The Black Hawk pitched violently, trying to spoil the enemy's aim, but it was too big, too slow. Lieutenant Miller had stopped shouting. He was kneeling beside her now, his hand hovering over her shoulder but not touching her. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that interference now would only guarantee their deaths. He was watching the ridge, watching the inevitable unfold. Elena forced herself to breathe. In, out, pause. This was the respiratory pause, the bottom of the breath where the body was most still. The shaking in her hands smoothed out. The reticle stopped dancing and settled into a gentle hover. The enemy loader tapped the gunner's helmet. Clear. The gunner's finger curled around the trigger of the RPG. Elena didn't think about her rank. She didn't think about the ammo crates or the insults or the cold. She thought about the bullet. A 190-grain projectile that had to fly through 700 meters of turbulent air and arrive at a specific point in space and time before a rocket could leave a tube. She was aiming at empty space, trusting the wind to carry the metal home. It was a leap of faith. "Send it," she whispered. Her index finger, numb inside the glove, found the break point of the trigger. She applied pressure, straight back, steady and smooth. The resistance of the steel mechanism felt immense, like pushing against a mountain. The world went silent. The rotor wash, the gunfire, the wind, it all vanished. There was only the crosshair floating in the void to the left of the enemy. She squeezed. The rifle bucked violently against Elena's shoulder, a sharp, punishing kick that drove the polymer stock into her bruised clavicle. The muzzle brake vented the expanding gases to the sides, kicking up a sudden cloud of snow that momentarily obscured her vision. For a sniper, the shot does not end when the trigger breaks. It ends with the follow-through. Elena gritted her teeth, keeping her cheek welded to the stock, forcing her eye to stay open behind the scope. She had to see the impact. She had to know. At 700 meters, the bullet took just over 1 second to bridge the gap. In the compressed reality of combat, that second stretched into an eternity. It was enough time for the heart to beat twice. Enough time for the enemy on the ridge to fully depress the firing lever of the RPG. Through the distorted, green-tinted glass, she saw the result. The wind had done its work. The bullet, aimed at the empty air to the left, had drifted perfectly, riding the invisible river of turbulence. It struck the RPG gunner high in the chest, just below the collarbone. The kinetic energy of the .300 Winchester Magnum round was devastating. The gunner didn't just fall. He was thrown backward as if yanked by a cable. His body jerked violently to the right, pulling the launcher tube with him. In that exact microsecond, the rocket ignited. A streak of fire erupted from the tube on the ridge. But instead of flying true toward the hovering Black Hawk, the projectile corkscrewed wildly into the sky, thrown off course by the dying flinch of the shooter. It screamed over the helicopter's rotor disc, missing the main mast by 20 feet, and impacted the cliff face 100 meters behind them. The explosion was a dull thud, harmlessly turning rock into dust. "Impact! Target down!" Elena whispered, though she couldn't hear her own voice. The recoil impulse faded, leaving a ringing silence in her ears that even the helicopter couldn't penetrate. She cycled the bolt of the Mk-13 instinctively, lift, pull, push, down, ejecting the spent brass casing which landed steaming in the snow next to her face. She was ready for a second shot, but there was no one left to shoot. The loader on the ridge had scrambled for cover, disappearing behind the rocks. "Clear! The ridge is clear!" Lieutenant Miller's voice crashed back into her consciousness. He was staring at her. For a heartbeat, the war stopped. Miller looked at the distant ridge, then down at the small woman lying in the snow with a rifle that was too big for her. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with shock. He had expected her to miss. He had expected to die. But the helicopter pilot wasn't waiting for a moment of reflection. "LZ is hot! We are burning fuel! Get on the bird! Now! Now! Now!" the pilot screamed over the radio. Miller shook his head, snapping back to reality. "Move! Everyone move! Grab Svensson!" Elena scrambled to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, the adrenaline dump hitting her system with the force of a crash. She slung the heavy sniper rifle over her back. She wasn't leaving it. Not now, not ever. And grabbed the left side of Svensson's drag handle. "Up! On 3!" Miller grabbed the right side. 1, 2, 3! They heaved the wounded sniper off the ground. Svensson groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony, but he was alive. They ran toward the open ramp of the Black Hawk, heads ducked low against the rotor wash that threatened to knock them flat. Petty Officer Jacks was already at the ramp, waving them in, his machine gun held in one hand like a pistol. He grabbed Svensson's vest and hauled him into the cargo bay with a grunt of exertion. Miller scrambled in after him. Elena was the last one on the ground. She paused for a fraction of a second at the base of the ramp, looking back at the position they had held. The snow was churned and black with soot. The brass casings she had carried up the mountain lay scattered like gold coins among the rocks. "Vance! Get in!" Miller yelled, extending his hand. She reached out, grabbing his gloved hand. He pulled her aboard with a strength that nearly lifted her off her feet. As her boots hit the metal floor of the helicopter, the pilot pulled pitch. The Black Hawk lurched upward, banking hard away from the cliff face, putting gravity and distance between them and the kill zone. Elena collapsed onto the floor next to Svensson. The cabin was vibrating violently, smelling of hydraulic fluid and old sweat. She looked at her hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Miller. The lieutenant didn't say a word. He just nodded. It was a slow, deliberate nod. Elena leaned her head back against the vibrating wall of the fuselage and closed her eyes. The weight of the ammo was gone, but the weight of the rifle on her back felt right. The ascent was violent. The Black Hawk pilot flew like a man possessed, banking the aircraft at steep angles that pressed the passengers into the floor with crushing G-force. The open doors framed a dizzying, tilting view of the Hindu Kush mountains, a landscape of jagged teeth that spun and receded rapidly into the distance. Inside the cabin, the noise was a deafening, mechanical scream. The wind whipped through the cargo bay, freezing the sweat on their faces and swirling the smell of copper blood and spent gunpowder into a nauseating haze. Elena sat slumped against the bulkhead, her legs splayed out in front of her. The vibration of the airframe rattled her bones, but she barely felt it. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the last hour was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. She looked down at her hands. They were still wrapped around the Mk-13 sniper rifle. Her knuckles were white, the gloves stained with grease and soot. She tried to loosen her grip, to let the weapon rest, but her fingers refused to obey. It was as if the polymer and steel had fused to her flesh. In the center of the bay, the crew chief and petty officer Jax were working on Svensson. The sniper was pale, his skin the color of old parchment. The vibration of the helicopter made treating him a nightmare, but the crew chief was shouting into his headset, coordinating with the pilots to keep the flight as smooth as the hostile terrain allowed. "Pressure is dropping. Keep that line open," the chief yelled, though his voice was lost to the wind. Elena watched them work. She saw the blood-soaked dressings she had applied. They were holding. Just barely. Across the cabin, Lieutenant Miller sat on a jump seat. He had removed his helmet, revealing hair matted with sweat and helmet hair. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes hollowed by the stress of command. He wasn't looking at the map. He wasn't looking at Svensson. He was looking at her. For a long minute, Miller just stared. It wasn't the glare of a superior officer inspecting a subordinate. It was a look of profound, unsettled confusion. He looked at the oversized rucksack still strapped to her shoulders. He looked at the sniper rifle in her lap. He looked at the woman who, 20 minutes ago, he had ordered to stay behind because she was a liability. He leaned forward slightly, fighting the turbulence, and keyed his internal comms. "Vance," Miller said. His voice came through her headset, stripped of the shouting and the gunfire. It was quiet. Human. Elena raised her head slowly. "Sir?" "That wind call," Miller said, pausing as the helicopter dropped suddenly in an air pocket before correcting. "At 700 meters, in that canyon, that was not a guess." "No, sir," Elena whispered, her throat raw. "It was full value. Left to right." Miller nodded slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake or a commendation. In the culture of the teams, praise was rare, and silence was often the highest form of respect. But the way he looked at her had changed. The wall was gone. He leaned back into his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for 2 days. "Good work," he said. The channel clicked off. Elena rested her head back against the metal wall. The vibration of the engine hummed against her skull. Outside the open door, the sun was beginning to dip below the western peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The mountain that had almost killed them was now just a small, white shape on the horizon. She felt a tear leak from the corner of her eye, hot and stinging against her cold cheek. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't joy. It was the sheer, overwhelming relief of survival. She was alive. Svensson was alive. The team was intact. She pulled the sniper rifle closer to her chest, hugging it like a child. The barrel was still warm. Forward Operating Base Keystone was asleep when they returned, a sprawling grid of tents and barriers under the indifferent moon. The extraction had been a blur of medical personnel rushing the tarmac, the flashing lights of the ambulance taking Svensson away, and the sudden, jarring silence that follows the shutdown of a helicopter engine. 2 hours later, Elena stood in front of a cracked mirror in the female latrine. The water running into the basin was cold, but it felt cleansing. She scrubbed her face, watching the gray slurry of soot, camouflage paint, and dried sweat swirl down the drain. The face staring back at her looked older than it had 48 hours ago. The eyes were harder, rimmed with red, holding a 1,000-yard stare that hadn't quite focused back on the present. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was in a gray PT shirt and shorts, her bruised shoulders finally free of the crushing weight of the rucksack. But the phantom sensation of the straps was still there, a ghostly reminder of the burden she had carried. After drying off, she walked to the armory cage where Bravo Team was cleaning their weapons. It was a ritual, a necessary decompression. The smell of CLP oil and solvent was thick in the air. Lieutenant Miller was there, alone. He was wiping down the bolt carrier group of his carbine. On the workbench next to him sat the Mk-13 sniper rifle, cleaned and reassembled, looking innocuous and dormant. Elena walked in. She picked up a rag and began to wipe down the table, a reflex of her logistics training. "Svensson is out of surgery," Miller said without looking up. His voice was low, echoing slightly in the concrete room. "He kept the arm. He will shoot again, but his war is over for this rotation." "That is good news, sir," Elena replied quietly. Miller stopped scrubbing. He set the bolt down and turned to face her. He looked tired, stripped of the combat armor that made him look invincible. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the after-action report. "I finished the debrief with command," Miller said. He tapped the paper against the table. "The official record states that the RPG threat was neutralized by precise sniper fire from the team's designated marksman prior to his incapacitation. The logistics element provided critical resupply and medical aid." He paused, watching her face for a reaction. It was a lie. A political lie designed to maintain the mystique of the SEALs, to avoid the embarrassment of admitting that a support corporal had saved an elite unit when they failed to secure their perimeter. Elena looked at the rifle on the table. She remembered the weight of the trigger. She remembered the wind. She remembered the red mist in the scope. "I understand, sir," Elena said. Her voice was steady, devoid of bitterness. "It looks better on paper." Miller let out a breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. Politics, Vance. It's a messy business. But the men in that helicopter, they know. Jax knows. The pilots know. And I know. He reached into his cargo pocket again. This time he pulled out a small, heavy object. He placed it on the table and slid it across to her. It was a brass casing. A .300 Winchester Magnum shell, spent and cooling. The casing from the shot she had taken. Svensson wanted you to have this, Miller said. He woke up for a minute before the anesthesia took him under. He said, "Tell the mule she has a heavy kick." Elena picked up the casing. It was cold now, but it felt heavy in her palm. It was just a piece of brass, garbage to anyone else. But to her, it was heavier than the 80 pounds of ammo she had hauled up the Hindu Kush. It was proof. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said, closing her fingers around it. "Go get some sleep, Corporal," Miller said, turning back to his weapon. "We have a resupply flight in the morning. I need my logistics specialist sharp." "Yes, sir." Elena walked out of the armory, stepping into the cool night air of the base. She put the brass casing in her pocket. She didn't need a medal. She didn't need her name in a report. She walked toward her tent, her step light, her shoulders squared. She was Elena Vance. She carried the ammo. And when the time came, she took the shot. That was enough.